The president tweets a lot about Antifa and anarchists. The man shot and killed in Portland over the weekend was said to be a member of a local right-wing group called Patriot Prayer. Vigilante is a term some use to describe the Illinois teenager now accused of killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Some of what we see at these protests in recent months is clearly the work of organized groups on the left and the right. And some is also the byproduct of online disinformation about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, that some experts trace to Russian and other foreign actors. Sorting who's who and what is organized is a giant challenge for law enforcement. Here to share his expertise and insights, our CNN national security analyst, Peter Bergen, a vice president at New America. Peter, grateful for your time, because that is one of the challenges. You see these pictures, and it's who are these people? Is this all just spur-of-the-moment protest? To what degree are far left and far right organized groups infiltrating to stir up trouble? How do you track it?
Well, I think it is hard, John, because I don't think these are formal organizations. These are social movements. There's been a big discussion. The president himself suggested that Antifa should be labeled a terrorist organization. Well, the 2 problems of that. One is it's a loosely organized social movement. And 2, it's not illegal in this country to be either a pro Antifa supporter or a pro-Ku Klux Klan supporter or have any political views. What is illegal is to carry out, obviously, acts of violence in the name of these groups. That's different than, let's say, joining ISIS in this country, which is actually a crime. It's a designated foreign terrorist organization. If you or I chose to try and join ISIS or joined ISIS, we could be put in prison for 15 to 20 years. That is not the case with these loosely organized social movements that are exercising their First Amendment rights. Where the problem becomes, of course, is where they carry out acts of violence. And, it's an interesting question that we're probably not going to settle on this during this discussion, but the extent to which you could say that these acts of violence carried out for political purposes in the streets of the United States that we're seeing in Illinois, in Wisconsin, and also in Oregon, are they acts of domestic terrorism? Because terrorism is really carrying out acts of political violence against civilians. And we're seeing lethal acts of political violence, allegedly being carried out just this week.
Joining me now is Kenosha County Board Supervisor Zach Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez, thanks so much for being with us. I'm wondering what you think of how the police have handled both the aftermath of the Blake shooting and also the protests and the violence.
Thanks for having me today. The police, I think, have done as much as the guys on the ground can do, our day-to-day police officers. I think what we've seen here is failed leadership mostly on the part of Sheriff Beth here in Kenosha, not doing everything he could to assist his deputies as well as the city police officers.
What more do you think could have been done?
I think what needed to have happened was the sheriff needed to declare a state of emergency Sunday night right away when we knew that these protests were going to happen. We hoped they didn't get violent. He waited until the wee hours of Monday morning to do that, and then we looked to the governor, and the governor refused help from the federal government when we needed it very clearly after Monday night.
The governor did send in the National Guard. The sheriff said communication wires were crossed, I guess, with the governor's office, and that they had actually failed to request the National Guard when they thought they had. There was a Facebook group calling for citizens to arm themselves and to come down to the protests. They said to maintain order, protect property. Is that something you think is a good idea?
I don't think people need to go down to a place where we know there's going to be conflict with their firearms, but I've got nothing wrong with business owners protecting their business if they feel the police can't do that. I spoke with constituents in my district who called me the next day and said, I called 911 as my gas station or as my business was getting broken into, and I was told we didn't have enough officers to respond. And so for those people, I've got no issue with that. Protect your business, protect your livelihood, but I don't think we need people going to the scenes of protests. I think that adds more confusion than anything.
Tonight, police are looking for a suspect in this shooting, which occurred Saturday evening in Portland. The victim who was killed, according to the New York Times, was wearing a hat with the insignia of a far-right group called Patriot Prayer. That group's leader mourned the man's loss in a Facebook posting. And the Trump supporters are seen firing paintball pellets and spraying mace from the backs of their vehicles. Portland's police chief said his force had a strong presence on the streets on Saturday night, but still couldn't get its arms around those confrontations.
We had folks stationed at different areas, but it's very difficult when you have small groups of people spread throughout the city, too, who sometimes engage in violence acts with each other. I mean, we only have limited resources, so we can't be everywhere at the same time.
President Trump tweeted, "Rest in peace," referring to the Portland shooting victim. But the president so far has said only this about the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, referring to video of the Blake shooting.
I'm looking into it very strongly. I'll be getting reports, and I'll certainly let you know pretty soon. But I'll be, it was not a good sight. I didn't like the sight of it, certainly.
The Wisconsin Department of Justice and federal officials are investigating the Blake shooting as protests there have continued. Tonight, as a curfew again goes into effect in Kenosha County, the sheriff says more than 200 protesters have been arrested there since the Blake shooting. More than half those people, he says, from outside Kenosha.
There are people from outside Kenosha.
President Trump is now taking questions.
Not to come to Kenosha tomorrow.
No, because Kenosha was something we did a good job on. The governor didn't want us there. He didn't want the National Guard, as you know. He was very reluctant, but I give him credit because ultimately he said yes, and as soon as he said yes, the problem ended. But I have to see the people that did such a good job for me, and we're meeting with numerous people, and we have tremendous support in the state of Wisconsin, so I promise them when it all gets taken care of, we'll go.
Concerns, though, that it could exacerbate tensions and increase violence. Do you give any consideration
Well, it
to
could
that?
also increase enthusiasm, and it could increase love and respect for our country. And that's why I'm going, because they did a fantastic job. As soon as I called and told them, let's go, the whole problem stopped. That was, what, 6 days ago? Yeah, Jeff?
Mr. President, why are you not meeting with the family of Jacob Blake while you're there?
Well, I spoke with the pastor, wonderful man, the family's pastor, and I thought it would be better not to do anything where there are lawyers involved. They wanted me to speak, but they wanted to have lawyers involved, and I thought that was inappropriate, so I didn't do that. But I did speak with the pastor of the family, who's a fine man, a wonderful man, and I think we had a great talk. And I may at some point, do that, but they did have a lawyer that wanted to be on the phone, and I said, no, that's inappropriate, but I just gave my best regards. But again, I spoke with the pastor. Yeah, please.
I have a question on coronavirus, but first, you were just criticizing Joe Biden, saying he didn't mention the far left or Antifa during his speech today. You said you wanted to talk about left-wing political violence.
Yeah.
But I noticed you did not mention that your supporters were also in Portland this weekend, firing paintball guns at people, some form of pepper spray. So do you want to also take this chance to condemn what your supporters did?
Well, I understand they had large numbers of people that were supporters, but that was a peaceful protest. And paint is not, and paint as a defensive mechanism, paint is not bullets. Your supporters, and they are your supporters indeed, shot a young gentleman who, and killed him, not with paint, but with a bullet. And I think it's disgraceful. These people, they protested peacefully. They went in very peacefully. And I'll tell you what they're protesting. They're protesting when they turn on television or read whatever they may be reading, and they see a city like Chicago where 78 people were shot and 13 died, or a city like New York where the crime rate has gone through the roof, or a city like Portland where the entire city is ablaze all the time, and a mayor says, we don't want any help from the federal government. When these people turn that on and they see that, they say, this is not our country. This is not our country. That was a peaceful protest, totally.
It was a supporter of yours,
Go
Mr.
ahead,
President.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
It was a supporter of yours, Mr. President.
Are
you going to condemn the act? It was a supporter of yours, Mr. President, who killed someone that is accused of killing two people. It's a supporter of yours.
Are you going to condemn the actions of vigilantes like Kyle Rittenhouse?
We're looking at all of it. That was an interesting situation. You saw the same tape as I saw. And he was trying to get away from them, I guess, it looks like. And he fell. And then they very violently attacked him. And it was something that we're looking at right now, and it's under investigation. But I guess he was in very big trouble. He would have been. He probably would have been killed. But it's under investigation.
Do you think private citizens should be taking guns?
I'd like to see law enforcement take care of everything. I think everything should be taken care of, law enforcement. But again, we have to give our cops back, our police back, their dignity, the respect. They're very talented people. They're strong. They're tough. They can do the job. But we've taken it away. We don't want to have. When somebody makes a mistake, he chokes, or in some cases you have bad cops, so we have to take care of that. In other cases, they choke. They have a quarter of a second to make a decision. And sometimes they make the wrong decision. If they make the wrong decision, if they make the wrong decision in the other direction, they're probably dead. So they choke sometimes. And that goes on the evening news for weeks. And the thousands and tens of thousands of great things they do, nobody covers that. Nobody writes about that. But if they make a mistake, and again, the bad cops, everybody agrees they have to be very tough on bad cops. But sometimes you have a cop or a police person who is a good police person, right? Good. But they choke. The timing, and they go through this, and they study this, and they work on it all the time. They literally have a quarter of a second to make some of these decisions. And they make a wrong decision, and it's very devastating. But I will say this, I honor law enforcement. We wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for law enforcement. We have to stop this horrible left-wing ideology that seems to be permeating our country. And basically it's weakness. It's weakness on behalf of Democrat politicians or Republicans. We don't have problems. You take a look at our cities. Our cities are doing very well. They're safe. They're secure. I spent a lot of time in Texas, as you know, just a couple of days ago, and I was with the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. He was explaining they wouldn't put up with it for a minute. They just don't have the kind of problems that other people have. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
There you have it, the president taking just a few questions from reporters, this time taking questions from mainstream reporters, including our Caitlin Collins. The president there saying when he makes this visit to Kenosha, Wisconsin tomorrow, that he's not expected to meet with the family. He was asked whether or not he's spoken with the family, and he said that the Jacob Blake family wanted to have lawyers involved.
President Trump is now in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by police. Violence has erupted in the aftermath of Blake's shooting, and 2 people were allegedly killed by an armed vigilante. Many fear Trump's visit could inflame the divisions that have put the city and America on edge. Ryan Nobles is in Kenosha. And Ryan, can you tell us what the president is planning on doing there, and how has he been received so far?
Yeah, Brianna, so the president just arrived to this high school here behind me in Kenosha, his motorcade pulling up about 5 minutes ago. This was after the president toured a burned out building, a furniture store, about 5 minutes away from where we're standing right now, to kind of survey the damage that has come out of these protests and the violence in the wake of the shooting of Jacob Blake. Now, at this high school behind me, he's going to tour the Emergency Operations Center, which local law enforcement has set up in the wake of all the protests and violence. And then he's going to hold a roundtable discussion with local law enforcement, the local sheriff, as well as some high-level federal officials, as well as the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, and Attorney General William Barr. So that's the conversation the president is having right now. And as you can see, Brianna, it is mainly focused on the law enforcement response, not as much about the initial act that led to all these protests, and that is the shooting of Jacob Blake. Now, as you mentioned, the president at this point not necessarily reaching out to the family directly. There have been attempts for the two sides to come together, but it has not been received, and there's not been a definitive connection between the two. And as for the reception the president is getting where we're standing, there is a relatively small crowd, a mix of protesters and supporters. There were loud cheers for the president as his motorcade came by. But as you mentioned, Brianna, there is real concern from leadership here in Kenosha. The mayor of the city of Kenosha, the governor of Wisconsin as well, asking the president not to come because they do not view his visit as something that can bring this community together and solve some of the problems that they're dealing with right now. Brianna?
Yeah, the White House, Ryan, has promised a unifying visit, that is the purpose of President Trump's visit. All right, Koerri Elijah is a Kenosha resident. He was there the night the protests in his city turned deadly when 2 protesters were shot and killed and another one injured. Koerri, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to start just by getting your thoughts on the president's visit to Kenosha. Do you think that this is the right time for him to be there?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brianna. So I personally do, just because I feel like when situations like this arise, you know, it's up to the leader of the nation to step in and, you know, show support to the community. So I'm not upset that he's come. Honestly, maybe it should have happened a little sooner. Maybe, you know, maybe they could have waited a little bit. But either way, I feel like it's his job to show up.
So it's his job as president to show up. I wonder what you want to hear from him, what you think the community needs to hear from him.
So personally, I can only speak on the community where I reside. I don't feel like the community needs to hear anything specifically. I think it's more of like a presence thing, you know? People, I don't feel like they want to hear any campaign slogans or anything like that, especially when we're trying to heal and rebuild. But the presence is something that I feel is necessary.
And I guess personally, so for you, it's not so much hearing, it's him being there. Is there anything that you want him not to say or not to focus on that you think would not be the right message for this time?
I would like not to hear that the people of the community were the people that did this, because that's not the case. So as long as people aren't attributing the destruction to the people of the community, I'll be all right with anything else.
Okay. You live near where the deadly shooting happened. 17-year-old Kyle Wittenhouse is accused right now of shooting 3 people and killing 2 of them. You say that you saw this suspect before the shooting, that you heard the gunshots. Can you tell us more about that, what you saw and heard and experienced?
Yeah, so I documented pretty much the entire night, pretty much every night of the protests and riots. For months I've been documenting. So when I went down by the Kenosha Guard while before the protesters headed in that direction, just to kind of survey the scene, see what they were all about. You know, they were all friendly to me. Most people in the community know who I am, so they kind of, you know, came up to me, talked to me a little bit. But I noticed Kyle was there. He was kind of by himself. He was standing by some people, but he seemed to be alone, if that makes sense to you. I noticed that he was kind of chain smoking. He looked relatively young, so, you know, he seemed kind of nervous, so it kind of stood out to me. So from there, I kind of, you know, took a mental note of that. So when things happened later on, and I noticed him running past me by himself with no one chasing him, I thought it was interesting, which led me down to the scene where the shootings took place.
Koerri, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your thoughts and to hear what you have to say about this visit.
No problem.
I'm joined now by Tim Murtaugh. He's communications director for the Trump campaign. Tim, thanks for taking the time this morning.
Sure thing, Jim. Good to see you.
So first, you're aware of events in Kenosha. Will the president directly address the shooting of Jacob Blake in his comments tonight?
I think he will. He'll talk about what happened in Wisconsin, and I think he'll broaden it and talk about what we've seen in cities and states all around the country over the last couple of months. And the president understands that people absolutely have the right to protest, and he's also very concerned about fair and safe communities and safe policing, which is why he's taking the action he has. But he does not think that it is appropriate for cities across the country to erupt into violence as we've seen. And I think you've seen the president take appropriate steps today. I know you're reporting that the DOJ is conducting a civil rights investigation, and the president spoke to the governor of Wisconsin yesterday and is sending in federal law enforcement, just as he did to help with the folks in Portland. The president is determined that that law and order be restored, and so that we can all enjoy peace and prosperity as Americans. That is the president's main focus on those things.
As you're aware, there is now a 17-year-old young man from Illinois who's charged with intentional homicide, part of a group of armed untrained civilians who answered a call to come to Kenosha, in something of a law enforcement role here. Does the president condemn the use of vigilantes, in effect, to respond to these protests and violence?
Certainly. Look, American-on-American violence is not something that anyone can support or condone, and we condemn it fully. I think you heard the Vice President last night say very forcefully that having Americans harm other Americans is not the way to go about this. We have to be able to move forward as Americans in a peaceful manner, and the police have to be allowed to do their jobs, and we've seen this over and over again in city after city run by Democrats, Joe Biden's allies, where they have sided with the rioters instead of the police and instead of law-abiding citizens. And that's why you see police unions one after another lining up to endorse President Trump, because they know that Joe Biden and the Democrats have turned their backs on law enforcement. Joe Biden issued a statement about Portland last month that blamed the police for stoking, this is a direct quote, stoking the fires of division, and referred to the rioters as peaceful protesters.
Well, so some were peaceful. I witnessed and spoke to some of them, and trust me, we also reported on the violent protesters there, but Joe Biden has not said, I support violent rioters and looting. He hasn't said that. That's just a fact.
Well, he misdescribed people, and it actually has for 3 months now ignored the violence that's been occurring night after night in Portland, which is why I think you see him out now rushing to do so, because I think he has seen that people are wondering, even on your own network, Don Lemon, in fact, saying, boy, how much longer can Joe Biden ignore what's happening in these Democrat-run cities? And
I do want to ask, as I did about the president's comments here, because the president is arguing for 4 more years, and the violence you describe is happening. He's been in charge for 3.5 years or more at this point. Have his comments, have his policies helped to address these issues? And if so, where?
I think absolutely you have seen his policies help. The president has provided more economic opportunity to people who live in inner cities, to people who live in the black community, and for all communities, in fact, men, women, white, black, Latino, Asian, veterans, historic low unemployment for people all across the board, and economic opportunity is how you solve a lot of these problems. We just had another million people. Another million people, first-time unemployment benefits. I mean, during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the highest in a single week was 800-some thousand. We've had a million a week for several weeks now. Who does the president blame for that loss of jobs? I mean, the math is simple here. Jim, I think what would be blamed for the loss of those jobs is the global pandemic that is affecting every single nation on Earth. I feel like you guys have probably covered the coronavirus crisis a little bit.
The U.S. worse than most.
In fact, the president has led an unprecedented response. The private sector and the federal government joining together in really an unprecedented response to the coronavirus crisis. And we're seeing the economy already come back. 9.3 million jobs created in just the last 3 months. That is a record period of job creation in the history of this country.
That's because 25 million some odd jobs disappeared. I mean, the bottom line is still in the red.
Jim,
the bottom line is still in the red. So, but let's talk about the pandemic, because you're claiming a successful response there. Who does the president hold responsible for nearly 180,000 Americans who lost their lives to the pandemic? Who does he hold responsible?
I think it's very important to pinpoint where this virus came from, and that is China. And it's also important to note that while the president has been leading the country through the coronavirus crisis, Joe Biden has been doing nothing on the sidelines but criticize. Early on, the coronavirus task force has been meeting since January. The president restricted travel from China in January. At that time, Joe Biden said it was fear-mongering and xenophobic. So we know that Joe Biden would not have restricted travel from China. And if he had been president, Joe Biden,
just a very simple question, because he's
yes, we do know that because he said so,
Does he accept
Jim. If Joe Biden had been president, we'd be worse off today than we currently are.